That's the question millions are quietly asking right now as Erika Kirk, once seen as the devoted wife carrying forward her late husband Charlie Kirk's legacy, finds herself at the center of growing backlash, boycotts, protests, and financial scrutiny. But here's the deeper question for you. When public figures speak about faith, values, and leadership, should we judge them by their words? Or by what unfolds behind closed doors? Because right now, the space between those two things appears to be widening, and people are beginning to notice. And once public doubt takes root, can it ever truly be undone? 1. From sympathy to scrutiny, how public opinion shifted so fast. In the weeks following Charlie Kirk's death in September 2025, Erika Kirk stood at podiums across the country with tearful composure, speaking of grief, faith, and purpose. Supporters saw a woman navigating unimaginable loss while trying to preserve her husband's life's work. Many rallied behind her, offering donations, prayers, and unwavering loyalty. But grief in the public eye is never private, and grief tied to power is never simple. As Erika stepped into the CEO role at Turning Point USA, expectations followed her like shadows. Some admired her courage. Others quietly wondered, was she ready? Was she prepared for leadership? Or was leadership simply thrust upon her? Then something changed. Small controversies emerged. Donors noticed tonal shifts. Staff departures became harder to ignore. Social media sentiment, once supportive, began to sour. And the praise that once surrounded Erika slowly gave way to questions. Here's the question that lingered beneath it all. How quickly can trust erode, and what makes people turn from sympathy to suspicion? In Erika's case, it wasn't one mistake. It was a pattern. 2. The audio that changed everything. At what was meant to be a solemn memorial honoring Charlie Kirk's faith and influence, leaked audio surfaced online, and its emotional impact was immediate. In the recording, Erika could be heard laughing casually, discussing merchandise sales, voter engagement numbers, and event logistics. To some listeners, the tone felt more like a business briefing than a remembrance ceremony. Not because grief should follow one script, but because the contrast felt unsettling. When the public expects mourning, and instead hears strategy, it creates emotional dissonance. And that raises an uncomfortable question. When does honoring a mission cross the line into monetizing tragedy? Online backlash erupted almost instantly. Critics accused Erika of exploiting her husband's death for financial gain. Former supporters distanced themselves. And skeptics claimed the recording confirmed what they'd long suspected, that legacy had become branding. Whether fair or not, that audio didn't just circulate. It changed the story. 3. Protests, boycotts, and a movement under pressure. The backlash soon left the digital world and moved into physical spaces. Turning Point USA launched its Make Heaven Crowded 2026 tour at Harvest Christian Church in Riverside, California, a venue chosen for its religious symbolism and emotional resonance. The event was marketed as a revival-style gathering to honor Charlie's faith-driven mission. Inside, Erika spoke about salvation, leadership, and spiritual awakening. Outside, roughly 100 protesters gathered with signs condemning immigration enforcement, speaking out about the war in Gaza, and highlighting lawsuits involving Harvest Christian Fellowship and its lead pastor Greg Laurie over alleged sexual abuse. The contrast was striking. Inside, worship music, prayer, unity. Outside, megaphones, chanting, anger. And observers couldn't ignore the symbolism. Here's the question that emerged. When faith-based events attract protest instead of spiritual solidarity, what does that say about the movement's credibility? Rather than retreat, Erika responded forcefully. She publicly described anti-ICE protests as demonic. That word would change everything. 4. Demonic, the word that escalated the backlash. To Erika's supporters, the word sounded like spiritual warfare language, a faith-based condemnation of what she saw as injustice. To critics, it felt dehumanizing. Not simply wrong, but morally dangerous. Because when disagreement becomes demonization, dialogue collapses. And in a polarized culture, language carries consequences. Former allies spoke out. Donors quietly withdrew. Event organizers felt pressure to cancel appearances. Attendance declined. Suddenly, The story wasn't about grief or faith. It was about credibility. And that's when the public began asking the question no leader once asked. Where is the money coming from, and where is it going? 5. Following the money. Why financial scrutiny intensified. After Charlie Kirk's death, Erika didn't just inherit emotional responsibility. She inherited control. She became CEO of Turning Point USA. She oversaw major fundraising campaigns. She expanded tours. She approved merchandise lines. She assumed ownership of media ventures tied to Charlie's brand. Supporters argued she was simply continuing the mission. Critics countered. Is this ministry or marketing? When grief intersects with fundraising, people start wondering whether tragedy is being honored or leveraged. And as financial numbers surfaced, those suspicions intensified. Because the figures weren't small. 6. What Erika Kirk inherited financially. Here's what's publicly known, not speculation, not rumor, but documented income streams connected to Erika Kirk since Charlie's passing. First, life insurance. Reports indicate Charlie's policy paid out approximately $10 million, designated for Erika and their 2 children. Second, public donations. Fundraising campaigns across conservative media platforms reportedly generated nearly $10 million, including a Tucker Carlson affiliated fundraiser that alone raised more than $5 million. Third, salary. Charlie reportedly earned just under $400,000 annually as CEO of Turning Point USA. Erika stepped into that role. While her exact compensation hasn't been disclosed, many assume it matches or exceeds his. Fourth, real estate. Earlier in 2025, the Kirks sold their Scottsdale home for over $5 million, leaving roughly $2 million in net proceeds. Fifth, intellectual property. Charlie authored multiple books that continue generating royalties and hosted media ventures through Resolute Media Group, a for-profit company Erika now owns. Taken together, the picture is clear. Erika Kirk is financially secure. But that leads to the deeper question. Is wealth the issue, or how that wealth is framed, used, and explained? 7. Internet theories, conspiracies, and what's actually been proven. As finances grew, so did speculation. Social media lit up with claims of secret wire transfers, shell companies, closed-door meetings, and even rumors that Charlie altered his will shortly before his death. But here's the critical distinction. None of those claims have held up under scrutiny. Fact-checkers found no evidence of a mysterious $350,000 transfer. Alleged will changes traced back to manipulated posts. No verified documents support financial misconduct. Still, rumors persist. Why? Because when trust erodes, people fill the silence with suspicion. And once doubt takes root, facts alone rarely erase it. 8. Why perception matters more than proof. Even without confirmed wrongdoing, Erika's reputation continues to take damage. Not because of proven crimes, but because of emotional disconnect. When someone positions themselves as a moral authority, especially within faith communities, expectations rise. People expect humility, transparency, restraint. When actions feel transactional or language sounds dismissive, supporters don't just disagree, they disengage. And disengagement is more dangerous than outrage. Here's the question every leader eventually faces. Is influence something you inherit, or something you must continually earn? Right now, Erika Kirk appears to be learning that legacy alone isn't enough. 9. Faith, power, and the burden of public grief. It's important to acknowledge something rarely discussed. Grief changes people. There's no rulebook for losing a spouse, especially when that spouse was a national figure whose name moved millions of dollars and shaped political discourse. But grief tied to power creates unique tension. Is a fundraiser remembrance, or revenue? Is a tour ministry, or branding? Is sharp language conviction, or provocation? And perhaps most importantly, who gets to decide? 10. Turning Point USA at a crossroads. Turning Point USA itself now stands at a critical juncture. Once known for mobilizing young conservatives, the organization now faces reputational turbulence. Attendance has dipped in some regions. Boycotts continue. Protesters grow more organized. Donors ask harder questions. Some supporters see Erika as a fearless leader standing firm under attack. Others believe the organization has lost its moral compass, prioritizing optics, revenue, and influence over authentic outreach. Which raises another uncomfortable question. Can an organization outgrow its founder, or does it inevitably struggle without them? Charlie Kirk wasn't just TPUSA's leader. He was its brand, its voice, its emotional center. Replacing that kind of presence, especially under scrutiny, is nearly impossible. 11. IRS rumors. What's real and what isn't? As criticism intensified, online rumors spread that the IRS might be investigating Erika's finances. At present, there is no confirmed evidence of any IRS inquiry. No filings. No public records. No official statements. But the rumors persist, not because they're proven, but because they feel plausible to people already skeptical of her motives. Which highlights a modern truth. In the digital age, suspicion travels faster than verification, and corrections rarely reach as far as accusations. Once a narrative takes hold, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. 12. Why the audio still haunts her image. Months later, that leaked memorial recording still resurfaces. Not because of what was said, merch sales, voter numbers, logistics, but because of when it was said. People didn't expect laughter. They didn't expect casual business. They didn't expect emotional distance. And that emotional disconnect did more damage than any spreadsheet ever could. Here's the deeper question. Do leaders owe the public emotional alignment, or just organizational competence? There's no easy answer, but many clearly expected both. 13. The language of faith, inspiration or alienation. When Erika labeled anti-ICE protests demonic, she likely meant spiritual opposition, not personal hatred. But language doesn't exist in a vacuum. Words land differently depending on context, culture, and tension. To supporters, the words sounded like conviction. To critics, condemnation. To undecided observers, polarization. Which leads to another key question. Does strong leadership require strong words, or strategic restraint? In fractured times, restraint builds bridges. Absolutism burns them. And bridges, once burned, are hard to rebuild. 14. The merchandise problem. Branding versus belief. Another controversy fueling Backlash is aggressive merchandising tied to Charlie Kirk's legacy. Supporters argue merchandise funds operations and spreads messages. Critics argue it commercializes grief. And once again, perception matters. When memorials feel transactional, people don't just disengage, they feel manipulated. And that feeling lingers. So here's the uncomfortable question. At what point does fundraising become branding, and branding become exploitation? The line feels thinner than ever. 15. Why older audiences are watching closely. For audiences aged 40 to 65, this story resonates differently. They've lived through cycles of rise and fall. They've seen trusted leaders lose credibility not through scandal, but through tone, posture, and misjudgment. They understand that legacy isn't inherited. It's preserved. Which raises another reflection. How many reputations collapse not because of wrongdoing, but because of how power is handled? 16. Erika Kirk's defense. What supporters say. To be fair, Erika Kirk isn't without defenders. They argue. As she's a widow under extraordinary pressure. As she stepped into leadership during crisis, not ambition. As she's continuing her husband's mission, not exploiting it. As she's facing politically motivated attacks. They also argue grief doesn't follow scripts, and emotional conformity shouldn't be demanded from someone mourning. And that's a valid perspective. Which brings us to a balanced question. Where does compassion end, and accountability begin? 17. The legacy question. What would Charlie have wanted? Perhaps the most emotionally charged question of all. What would Charlie Kirk have wanted? Would he approve of the tours? The fundraising? The merchandise? The language? The confrontations? No one can answer that. But people speculate anyway, because legacy invites interpretation. And the more controversial actions become, the louder that speculation grows. 18. Influence without trust is fragile. History teaches one lesson clearly. Influence without trust doesn't last. You can have platforms, donors, stages, and microphones, but when people stop believing in your intentions, those tools lose power. Right now, Erika Kirk still holds influence. But whether she retains trust remains uncertain. And trust, once fractured, rarely heals quickly. Which leads to a final question here. Can reputation recover once skepticism becomes widespread, or does it simply fade into irrelevance? 19. The bigger picture. Faith, politics, and profit. Beyond Erika Kirk, this story reflects a broader cultural tension. Faith organizations increasingly operate within political ecosystems. Political movements increasingly rely on personal brands. Personal brands increasingly monetize influence. And when those three forces converge, accountability becomes complicated. Not because wrongdoing always exists, but because perception becomes reality. And reality shapes trust. 20. The question that still lingers. So we return to the question we started with. What happens when grief turns into influence, and influence turns into suspicion? Does leadership require transparency, or just conviction? Does faith demand humility, or strength? Does legacy entitle authority, or require accountability? And perhaps most importantly, when public trust fractures, can it ever truly be restored? Because Erika Kirk's story isn't just about one woman, one organization, or one movement. It's about what happens when power, grief, money, faith, and influence collide, and the world watches closely to see which force wins. Because is someone a minister? A CEO? A public servant? A political operative? Or all of the above? And when roles blur, expectations collide. That collision, between identity, authority, grief, and money, is at the heart of why Erika Kirk's story resonates far beyond her own inner circle. It isn't just about one woman stepping into leadership after tragedy. It's about what happens when private loss becomes public power, and the audience can't tell where one ends and the other begins. This story mirrors a much broader struggle playing out across modern leadership. Who gets to lead? Who gets to profit? Who gets to grieve? And how? And most importantly, who decides when something feels wrong, even if nothing illegal has been proven? Because once perception shifts, facts alone rarely bring it back. 20. Why this story isn't going away. Despite fact-checking efforts, public statements, clarifications, and denials, this story continues gaining traction. Why? Because it's not just about numbers. It's about narrative. And narratives thrive on unresolved tension, on unanswered questions that linger longer than official explanations ever do. Right now, the tension looks like this. A grieving widow inherits power. That power generates money. That money raises questions. Those questions meet defensive language. That language alienates supporters. Alienation breeds speculation. Speculation fuels backlash. And backlash feeds the cycle. Until something breaks. But what breaks first? The leader, the movement, or the audience's patience? Public controversies don't persist because of evidence alone. They persist because they feel unfinished. And Erika's story feels unfinished to many people watching from the outside. Not because they believe wrongdoing has been proven, but because they believe something unresolved is still happening beneath the surface. And unresolved tension is addictive. It invites speculation. It breeds theories. It creates emotional investment. And emotional investment, whether supportive or hostile, keeps stories alive far longer than truth ever does. So the question becomes, what exactly feels unresolved here? Is it grief? Is it motive? Is it money? Is it leadership style? Is it tone? Is it authenticity? Or is it simply that people feel something changed too fast, and no one knows how to articulate what that change really was? 21. What happens next? So what's next for Erika Kirk? Several possibilities remain, each carrying its own risks. As she could shift tone, embrace transparency, and attempt to rebuild trust. As she could double down on messaging and further polarize audiences. As she could step back from public leadership entirely. Or the controversy could slowly fade, replaced by the next viral crisis. But here's the truth. Public figures rarely control the narratives that define them, especially once distrust enters the equation. Because distrust doesn't ask for proof. It asks for pattern. And right now, critics believe they see one. Erika doesn't control this narrative. The audience does. And once the audience decides how a story feels, facts become secondary to emotion, even if those facts are technically correct. So what happens when leadership becomes less about truth and more about trust? And what happens when trust collapses faster than facts can keep up? 22. The audience question. What do you think? Now let's turn this conversation back to you. Do you believe Erika Kirk is being unfairly targeted, or rightly scrutinized? Is this story about grief, or greed? About faith, or finance? About leadership, or branding? About sincerity, or strategy? Or is it simply about what happens when private tragedy collides with public power? Because depending on your answer, this story looks very different. To some, Erika is a widow trying to survive unimaginable loss while holding together a movement larger than herself. To others, she's a brand strategist capitalizing on tragedy. To some, she's neither villain nor victim, just overwhelmed. To others, she's calculating. And that's why this story keeps dividing audiences instead of uniting them. Because the conflict isn't really about what happened. It's about what people believe happened. And belief, once emotionalized, is almost impossible to reverse. 23. What this story reveals about modern influence. In today's world, influence no longer flows only from institutions. It flows from personalities, from podcasts, from viral clips, from emotional storytelling, from outrage, from vulnerability, from visibility. And once influence becomes monetized, it becomes vulnerable. Because people don't just question what you say, they question why you're saying it. They don't ask, is this legal? They ask, is this sincere? And sincerity, once questioned, infects everything. A donation becomes suspicious. A speech becomes performative. A tear becomes strategic. A prayer becomes branding. And that's exactly what's happening here. Not because wrongdoing has been proven, but because intent feels unclear. And when intent feels unclear, trust erodes, even in the absence of evidence. So the deeper issue isn't Erika's finances. It's her perceived motives. And perceived motives shape public memory far more than balance sheets ever will. 24. The final takeaway. Legacy isn't inherited. Whether Erika Kirk ultimately rebuilds her reputation or not, this story leaves us with a powerful reminder. Legacy isn't inherited. It's protected. It's reinforced. It's earned, repeatedly. Charlie Kirk built an empire through conviction, charisma, emotional connection, and ideological clarity. Supporters didn't just follow him, they believed in him. They trusted his voice. They trusted his heart. They trusted that when he spoke, it came from something real. Erika inherited that empire. But inheritance doesn't guarantee alignment. And alignment, in public leadership, matters more than almost anything else. Because movements don't run on policy alone. They run on belief. And belief collapses the moment people feel emotionally misled, even if unintentionally. So the real challenge Erika faces isn't scandal management. It's emotional credibility. And emotional credibility, once fractured, is far harder to rebuild than reputation. 25. Closing reflection. So let me leave you with one final question. When influence, faith, money, and grief collide, who decides what's authentic? Is it the leader, the followers, the critics, the donors, the media, or history? Because long after protests fade, rumors die, and tours end, legacy remains. And how Erika Kirk is remembered may depend less on what she inherited, and more on what she chooses to become. Have you ever watched a public figure unravel and wondered, was this inevitable? Or did one moment, one decision, quietly set everything in motion long before anyone noticed? Because that's exactly what many former supporters are now asking about Erika and the organization she leads. The fall from sympathy to suspicion. Not long ago, Erika was widely seen as a grieving widow, a woman suddenly forced into the public spotlight after losing her husband, Charlie, in devastating circumstances. Sympathy poured in. Support flooded her social media. Supporters rallied behind her, convinced she was courageously carrying forward his legacy. At first, the public mood wasn't critical. It was protective. People wanted to believe in her. They wanted her to succeed. They wanted her survival story to become a triumph story. But today, her reputation looks very different. The whispers haven't faded. The backlash hasn't cooled. And what started as quiet skepticism has turned into widespread distrust. So how did things fall apart this fast? And more importantly, can public trust ever be rebuilt once it breaks this deeply? Let's take a closer look. When rumors won't stay buried. At first, the most explosive story, a so-called clandestine meeting, was dismissed as misinformation. Critics said it was speculation amplified by AI-generated content and online rumor mills. Supporters echoed that sentiment, calling it nothing more than digital gossip. And technically, that may have been true. But here's the real issue. Even when rumors are proven false, public perception doesn't always reset. Because when people hear about over $20 million raised, a non-stop fundraising appeals, a nationwide tours, a merchandise launches, a leaked audio discussing monetization strategies tied to a memorial event, legality stops being the focus. Optics take over. And people stop asking, is this allowed? They start asking, is this right? Is it ever appropriate to mix mourning with marketing? Can grief coexist with fundraising and still feel sincere? Where exactly is the line between honoring someone's legacy and capitalizing on their memory? These questions became unavoidable. And once questions become unavoidable, silence becomes suspicious. The charity defense, and why it didn't work. Erika has consistently pointed to charitable actions in response to criticism. Supporters highlight a $1 million donation through the Charlie Kirk Legacy Fund to help a 13-year-old battling cancer. They emphasize her humanitarian initiatives, her public prayers, her speeches about faith, and her emotional appeals to unity and healing. She later accepted a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom for Charlie from Donald Trump, a moment meant to symbolize respect, honor, and national recognition. On paper, those gestures look powerful. They look compassionate. They look meaningful. They look generous. But here's the problem. Once trust erodes, even generosity gets questioned. Instead of asking, is she doing good? Critics began asking, why now? Instead of saying, this proves sincerity, they said, this feels strategic. And perhaps most damaging of all, who benefits most? For many former supporters, the damage had already been done. Because when money, grief, politics, and influence collide this quickly, people stop offering the benefit of the doubt. They begin reading between the lines, even when the lines themselves are technically clean. And that's when boycott chatter began gaining traction. Not because people had proof, but because they had discomfort. And discomfort, when ignored, doesn't fade. It mutates into distrust. Why IRS rumors refuse to die? Here's something most people missed. The IRS rumors didn't appear out of thin air after Charlie's death. They had already been circulating quietly long before, dismissed as internet noise, brushed off as partisan attacks, written off as routine speculation surrounding any major political organization. But then something unexpected surfaced. Charlie himself had reportedly asked for TPUSA's financial books to be audited. And that raised eyebrows. Because let's be honest, how often do leaders voluntarily invite scrutiny unless something feels off? Most people don't request audits unless they're either exceptionally cautious, extremely ethical, or quietly concerned. So when talk of a possible IRS investigation resurfaced after his death, some supporters didn't see it as random. They saw it as unfinished business. Something Charlie may have already been wrestling with privately, something unresolved, unspoken, and now out of his hands. And that's when the story darkened. The leaked audio that changed everything. Just 2 weeks after Charlie passed away, leaked audio surfaced of Erika speaking to her internal team. What shocked people wasn't necessarily what she said. It was how she said it. Instead of sounding fragile, devastated, or emotionally fractured, which many expected, she sounded energized, strategic, motivated, organized. She spoke about. This was supposed to be a memorial. But to many listeners, it didn't sound like remembrance. It sounded like a launch. And that's when people began asking questions that changed everything. Charlie's parents didn't attend the memorial. And afterward, they stayed silent. At the time, few people noticed. Grief fractures families in unpredictable ways. Absence doesn't always signal conflict. Silence doesn't always mean protest. But after the leaked audio surfaced, many began connecting dots. The emotional shift. From sympathy to skepticism. Here's where the story takes its sharpest turn. What began as discomfort became distrust. Former supporters didn't just walk away quietly. Many became outspoken critics. The tone shifted from concern to accusation. From confusion to conviction. And in this case, critics believe they see one. Financial momentum mixed with grief. Politics blended into mourning. Faith language layered over fundraising strategy. Branding embedded in bereavement. Even when no laws are broken, reputations can still collapse. Because reputations aren't built on legality. They're built on trust. And trust is emotional, not procedural. That's what Erika now faces. Not investigation, but interpretation. Not courtroom risk, but credibility collapse. And credibility collapse rarely reverses cleanly. Is this about Erika, or something bigger? Here's where things get complicated. Is this really about one person? Or is it about what happens when activism, celebrity, grief, money, and politics become indistinguishable from one another? Because once audiences feel emotionally manipulated, even unintentionally, something shifts. Sympathy turns into suspicion. Loyalty turns into distance. Connection turns into critique. And the question becomes less about facts, and more about feeling. Does this feel honest? Does this feel human? Does this feel sincere? Does this feel right? For many former supporters, the answer has quietly become no. And once that answer settles, logic rarely changes it. Because feelings write memory. The question no one can avoid. So now, the real question isn't whether Erika can survive another scandal.